Good morning and welcome back to Ecocentric. In my video, Seed, Something You Need to Know, a viewer requested an in-depth description of what exactly GMO seeds are. After exchanging a couple of comments, I realized it would be a video in and of itself. I did a YouTube search to see what was out there, and to my surprise, it was very little. And what there was a muddy description. GMO stands for Genetically Modified Organism. There is a misconception that we have been genetically modifying plants since the dawn of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. This has even been promoted by high-profile people like Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, bear with me and you decide. If you take any trait from a wild population, you will find a wide variability that is centered around a certain point. If I were to ask, how tall is a Chinese man? Well, you might say that's a silly question. No two of them are the same height, which is a good point. But we can make a graph, put height on the bottom, and the percent of population up the side. We can't measure every man in the population, so we take a large sample and measure them. And we put the results on a line graph, because there's not like, okay, you're 5'7" or you're 5'8". There is a continual range of heights. And we get something like this. The high point of that bell-shaped curve will be the height of where most Chinese men would measure in at. The reason is this is the best height for men in the conditions that that ethnic group developed in. That's not to say that genetics that result in short or tall Chinese men are bad genetics. Because if we were to measure Caucasian men, for instance, that's the so-called white, we would find them taller. And men in some ethnic groups are shorter than the average for Chinese men. It's just that that's the best height for the conditions that the Chinese ethnic group developed in. The same goes for any trait in any species. So we'll remove the height and percent population here now. And before we go to plants, another human trait, eye color. I don't know what they teach in high school nowadays, but when I was in high school, they taught that we had two distinct genes for eye color. One was brown and dominant, the other was blue and recessive. If you had gotten a brown-eyed gene from both your parents, then you would have brown eyes. If you got a brown-eyed gene from one parent and a blue-eyed gene from the other parent, you'd have brown eyes. The only way to have blue eyes would be to have both parents donate a blue-eyed gene. One doesn't have to look at very many sets of eyes to realize that's not true. There's deep blue eyes, light blue eyes, green eyes, light and dark brown eyes. This is the so-called azale eyes, and depending on the mixture you can see that there is blue in here and brown. What they all have in common is that it's some mixture of brown and blue. While brown is more prevalent, when the genes are mixed, there's a fight for dominance. So back to plants. Now imagine a really weedy bed. Because all the plants are fighting for dominance, they grow together, but none of them grows to their best. In a wild plant species, there's a wide diversity of genetics, and the genes fight for dominance. And many are not fully expressed. However, in any environment where a plant grows, some will do better than others. And like the heights of men in any given ethnic group, those are the plants whose genetics are better suited to that environmental conditions than the other plants growing around it. So the example that I can give here is amaranth. There's no amaranth developed to grow in my climate. That's for domestic use, and you get these big tall amaranth plants with the huge flower heads. But we do have a wild amaranth. It's called red-rooted amaranth. Amaranth reflexus is the scientific name. So amaranth can grow here. I've been checking out the domesticated amaranth, and it seems that the ones that are available are actually developed for more of a grassland species. They have a drier and hotter summers than we have here. So I'm interested in seeing if I can develop a variety of amaranth that will grow well in my climate. So first I examine the growing wild plants, and I'll save the seeds from the best growing individuals. Originally, we have your basic bell-shaped curve that shows a wide genetic diversity, and I select the seeds from only the best growing plants. Over several generations, my plant genetics will do this. As we go to this point, two things becomes apparent. The features of the plant become more uniform, and if I keep the wild species away, they will produce what we call true to seed. Also, because the genetic diversity is greatly reduced, the genetics that remain become more pronounced, so I could get a bigger seed head, a taller plant, larger leaves, and we get what is the so-called heritage variety. It's a variety that is adapted to my climate, no special features selected for, just the ability to grow in the climate that I've developed it in. This variety would not work in a grassland or hot climate. You would have to have more moist maritime climate to grow an amaranth species that I would develop. I didn't modify the genetics. All I did was selected from what nature gave me. You think of the weedy bed again. Instead of removing unwanted plants, what you would do is make a new bed and take out the plants you wanted and transfer them over to the new bed. In so doing, you would have inadvertently transferred over other weed seeds and probably even some weed plants to the new bed. It would take several tries of doing this, making new beds and transplanting your selected plants over before you got a bed that was just the plants you wanted. And those plants, they would grow better with less weed pressure. The same thing works for genetics. So now I have my amaranth that's adapted to my climate. It's growing really well. Amaranth, as I said, is growing mainly as a grain crop or for the flower heads themselves. But a plant-based fiber can be gotten out of the stems for making twine. I've got some here somewhere. This is the twine I made from another plant, out of the stem. And one of the traits of our amaranth is its red root. So I can theoretically examine each plant to see how red the root is. On one end, we'd have hardly any color in the root at all, and on the other end you'd have a pure red root with the red going part way up the stem. So I select for the reddest of the roots, And over generations, the genetics of my plant will go like this. Once again, I'm eliminating the genetics that would make a more white root, and you'd have more of the proteins causing the red coloring in the plant. Theoretically, it would extend up the stem, and I'd end up with a red-stemmed amaranth. Because I'm selecting for a particular trait, then I would call it either red-stemmed amaranth or Pesticide amaranth or something like that. You have to Latinize the names for doing scientific names, eh? And this is what we would call a heirloom plant. That being said, the reason you don't see heritage very much is because for generations now, we've been just selecting traits out of plants that have been developed in ancient times. So most of your plants that you get now have been developed in the last 200-300 years, and they're heirlooms, not heritage. But there's issues that would arise with this method. The genes that result in what we see as a physical trait are grouped into clumps that we call chromosomes. This being the human chromosomes here, we have 23. So all of your millions of traits are grouped into 23 groups. So when we're selecting, let's say this D gene here is the flower color, and we're selecting for the bluest of flowers, and that is the capital D. In selecting for that capital D, we inadvertently are selecting for this lowercase h down here. That can result in a species that, okay, you've got your trait that you wanted, but maybe it's susceptible to a certain disease. Now that you didn't want. There's no way around it because the two traits are linked. Now, let's say John down the road, he developed for a different flower color, and his variety isn't susceptible to that disease. So what happens if we take the two heirlooms and cross them? Maybe we'll get a flower that's close enough to the color you wanted, but also not susceptible to that disease. And that's where your hybrids come in. This isn't so much of an issue for the heritage, because in the heritage we just selected for a broad genetic diversity that does the best in a given set of circumstances. But for heirlooms, in trying to select out human preference for a certain fruit or flower type, whatever, like I said, we inadvertently are selecting out for traits that we may not want. The thing is, we can't separate those traits, so the only way to get the benefit of that particular hybrid would be to develop the heirlooms and then experiment with crossing the heirlooms to see if we can get a beneficial hybrid that will give us the fruit we want plus the disease resistance or bug resistance or whatever. Because of the fight for dominance that I already mentioned, the only way to get this beneficial cross is to first narrow down the genetics to an heirloom and then cross the two heirlooms back together. Going from a wild plant to the crossing of heirlooms is not something that can be done by one person. It takes time to develop a heirloom, So the producers of hybrid seeds, they're experimenting with already existing heirlooms. Hybrid seeds could be considered genetic manipulation, I guess, in that the development is based on experimenting with genetics instead of just how the plant looks, tastes, etc. But it still doesn't meet the definition of genetically modified. So hybrid seeds don't carry the risk of GMOs, which I'll talk about in a bit. If your goal is just to grow a plant or to grow food, hybrid, heritage, heirloom, it really doesn't matter. There's two reasons for choosing heritage or heirloom seeds over hybrid. One is for saving seeds. The characteristics produced by an hybrid seed is only known for that generation. To become the best gardener you can be, and for food security, you need to have an idea of what to expect from the seed you plant. It takes time to stabilize the genetics, so why do the work that's already been done? 2. Producing beneficial hybrids requires the breeder to start with heirlooms. In purchasing heirlooms, you help the producers of heirloom seeds to keep the varieties alive for future experiments. This is where it's nice to try all the things just because you can, and to, like I said, help keep those varieties alive. If an hybrid variety is what you need for your situation, then go right ahead. Purchase the hybrids and grow those out. Support the people that's doing this experimenting in this manner. Just remember, as long as we have heirlooms, we can produce beneficial hybrids. Without the heirlooms, we have neither. Now, we have other issues that no amount of artificial selection or genetic manipulation is going to help with. For the most part, they are factory farming issues. For a large farm and a large population to feed, they need to squeeze as much production as possible from every square inch of ground. They can't afford to lose crops to insects and small mammals, so pesticides are used in abundance. 2. Weeds, which is just a fact of life, but they reduce crop yields, so we poison them with herbicides. 3. In the system we have, well, think about it. If you grow a bed of carrots, and you harvest your carrots in your backyard, you'll keep the big ones, the small ones, the twisty ones. Doesn't matter. You go to the store, the same person, and you're going to buy carrots, you'll look over what is available and get the biggest and the best looking carrots that are there. That results in the small ones and the twisty ones being discarded. So, a big farmer, he has to do everything he can to produce the perfect looking vegetable out of every plant. So Monsanto created a soy by taking a gene from a bacteria that was resistant to their glyphosate herbicide called Roundup and inserting it into the chromosome of a soy plant. They followed this with corn, canola, sugar beets, cotton, and alfalfa. Apparently wheat is still under development. Basically all the most popular North American crops. So now these crops are resistant to glyphosate. The herbicide will kill any broadleaf plant. The farmers now can spray as much Roundup as necessary to kill anything but the crop they want. So how did they manage that? This is a diagram about Bt corn. So remember, they have Roundup Ready corn. Bt, if you've been doing the research, you may know that that is an organic, so-called organic pesticide. It's a bacteria that produces a protein that turns toxic in the stomach of insects. and this is where they give the insects indigestion and the insect dies. Apparently, an insect has an alkaline stomach, whereas mammals have an acidic stomach. So they say this Bt is in danger to higher level animals. This is a close-up version of the DNA, which is what makes up your chromosomes. This top part here is the chromosome of the bacteria, with the yellow part being that portion that makes the protein. Your DNA is basically what biologists would call a catalyst. In other words, it causes the chemical reaction that creates the proteins, but it doesn't get used up in the chemical reaction itself. So scientists have been able to figure out with certain traits what part of your DNA builds the protein that results in that trait. With enzymes, they are able to break apart the DNA and take this part that produces that protein that turns toxic in the stomach of insects, and they take the corn DNA. Using enzymes, they basically weaken and split the chromosome. They mix the chromosomes with the Bt gene, and when those chromosomes recombine, they include that Bt gene in with them. Then they can grow out that cell into a full-blown plant and produce seeds from it, and then they've got what they call Bt corn. Basically, what you've done is, instead of now having to spray the crop with this mixture of bacteria, the crop itself is producing the poison. So eating Bt corn, or most products made from it, would be the same as mixing up the Bt pesticide and drinking it. They say it's perfectly safe because Bt is harmless to mammals, including humans. So what does the precautions on the Bt pesticide say? Keep out of reach of children. It's not going to hurt you, but for some reason you got to keep it out of reach of children. Caution! Eye irritant. Avoid contact with skin, eyes, or clothing. Avoid breathing dust, spray, mist. Wear long sleeve shirt, long pants, waterproof gloves, shoes, and socks, as well as eye goggles when handling or applying the product and during all cleanup activities. But it's not going to hurt you. No. Well, you decide. I have another question to put out on the interwebs. This is an artist's rendition of your DNA, which, as I said, is what makes up your chromosomes. So they can take a particular trait, and playing with the DNA, they can figure out what part of the DNA causes that trait. So they know that, or they can figure out what trait this piece of the DNA makes. They can figure out what trait this part of the DNA causes. Now, for intelligent beings, and if we were to make up something, we have, okay, this piece of the equipment does this piece of the equipment does that, and it's all separate. But life is not so simple. As I said, DNA is a catalyst for building proteins. We have two pieces of DNA side by side that's building two different proteins. But what does this piece of DNA do? Does that build another protein? I mean, with all the millions of traits, really, how do we know that your DNA is split into actual genes that don't overlap? So, that being said, we go back to our point where they took the Bt gene from the bacteria and inserted it into corn. Fine enough, This gene is going to make the protein that produces that toxic protein. Gene is going to do its normal corn thing. This gene is going to do its normal corn thing. But what happens here? And here. So, you're eating Bt corn. In essence, you're eating a insecticide that's been soaked in an herbicide that may or may not be carrying proteins that we know nothing about. There's no reason to be nervous about that. None whatsoever. That's the facts. You can take it with a grain of salt, or you can take it with a full box of salt if you want. But that's what we've got in most of our foods. And to avoid that, corn. You've got corn syrup, modified corn ingredients. Soy is in an awful lot of products. So most of your store-bought foods nowadays, if it's processed beyond the basic foods, and if you buy mass-produced corn and stuff, then you're basically eating poison laced with poison. You can do your own research, but as I told B. Savage, sometimes that's difficult. I have a Bachelor of Science, and one of my university professors said, you go to college to learn about your chosen career. You go to university to learn how to learn about your chosen career. So basically, university teaches you how to research and how to discern between facts and misinformation. So in the end, you have to decide, take what I've told you there and what other people are telling you, and decide what you think is true. So if that was helpful, great. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.